The Reclaimer, a Commonwealth deep space exploration vessel, cut through the void like a dagger, its hull glinting against the backdrop of the swirling nebulae beyond. Inside the dimly lit bridge, the hum of engines provided a steady background rhythm, punctuated by the occasional beeps and whirs of various instruments. Captain Thera Voss sat in her command chair, eyes locked on the holographic display floating before her. She was a seasoned officer, her short-cropped hair flecked with gray, eyes sharp and unwavering. This mission was far from her first dance with danger, but something about it felt different. In her gut, she knew they were heading into a trap. "Captain," came the gravelly voice of First Officer Kale, a Rillian tactician whose blue skin shimmered under the low lighting. "We're about to enter the designated coordinates. Preparing to drop out of warp in 5, 4. The countdown ended with a shudder that rippled through the Reclaimer's hull. Stars stretched and twisted as the ship exited hyperspace, revealing the desolate star system where the distress signal had originated. The main view screen flickered, displaying a lifeless star surrounded by a handful of scorched planets, each one battered by its sun's merciless radiation. "Scan the area," Voss ordered, her voice calm but authoritative. "I want to know what we're dealing with." Lieutenant Lyra, the ship's tech specialist, worked her console with practiced speed. Her cybernetic eyes flickered, reflecting the streams of data pouring into her neural interface. "Captain, I'm picking up a faint signal on multiple frequencies. It's coming from the third planet in the system, definitely artificial, but it's fragmented. It looks like..." Her voice trailed off as she decrypted the message. A cold, distorted voice crackled through the speakers. "Deathworlders has sneaky bastards. Beware." A murmur rippled through the bridge. The crew had heard the stories whispered tales of Deathworlds, planets so hostile that no life should exist on them, yet somehow creatures evolved there that defied logic. But this was the first time any of them had seen actual evidence of one. Captain Voss leaned forward, narrowing her eyes at the planet on the screen. It was shrouded in thick, swirling clouds that flashed with electrical storms. The surface, what little they could see, was covered in jagged terrain, roiling with seismic activity. The atmosphere itself was a toxic soup of sulfuric gases and volatile compounds. "Prepare the landing party," Voss ordered, standing up from her chair. "I want a shuttle prepped and ready. We're going down there." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The Commonwealth had strict protocols against landing on uncharted worlds, especially ones classified as potential death worlds. But Voss was never one to let protocol stand in the way of discovery or duty. The descent into chaos, the shuttle Redemption detached from the Reclaimer's docking bay and plunged through the planet's atmosphere like a meteor, buffeted by turbulence so intense it felt like the hull would shake apart. Captain Voss held her harness tightly, while the rest of her team, Lieutenant Lyra, First Officer Kale, and the hulking Golaric warrior Sergeant Zorak, braced themselves. "Hold on," shouted the pilot, a young ensign whose knuckles were white on the controls. "We've got pockets of ionized gas thrusters are barely holding." Outside the viewport, lightning arced across the sky in blinding flashes, revealing glimpses of a twisted landscape below. As they broke through the storm layer, they were greeted by a view that would haunt them for years to come, a landscape riddled with jagged, obsidian spires, rivers of molten rock, and dense, writhing vegetation that glowed with an eerie bioluminescence. "Landing zone identified," Kale reported, his hands dancing over the control console. "We're coming down in a clearing half a click from the distress signal. Minimal visibility, but it's the best we've got." The Redemption touched down with a bone-jarring thud. Steam and noxious gases hissed from cracks in the ground as the crew disembarked, their environment suits sealing with a hiss to protect them from the toxic atmosphere. "Stay close," Voss commanded, her voice crackling over the comms. "We have no idea what's out there." As the team moved through the jungle-like terrain, they quickly realized that nothing on this planet was natural, or at least not by the Commonwealth's understanding of biology. The trees were covered in a slick, mucus-like substance that dripped onto their helmets. Every so often, something in the underbrush rustled, but whenever they turned to look, There was nothing there. "Captain," Lyra's voice came through the comms, tinged with tension. "I'm picking up interference on the scanners. Something's trying to jam our signal." Voss's eyes narrowed. "Let's pick up the pace. We don't want to be out here longer than necessary." The Lost Outpost. After an hour of grueling traversal through the hellish landscape, they arrived at the source of the signal-a dilapidated outpost, half buried under layers of strange, spongy fungus. The structure looked ancient, its architecture foreign, with no markings to indicate its builders. Its metal walls were corroded, eaten away by the planet's caustic atmosphere. Sergeant Zorak took point, his plasma rifle at the ready, as the team approached the outpost's entrance. The doors had been torn open, as if something or someone had forced its way in. Lyra hacked into the access panel, causing the lights inside to flicker weakly to life. The interior was a graveyard of twisted metal and broken machinery, covered in the same bioluminescent mold that thrived outside. Faded bloodstains painted the walls, telling the story of a long-forgotten battle. As they delved deeper into the structure, the eerie silence was broken only by the occasional drip of water and the crackle of static over their comms. Lyra stopped suddenly, her eyes widening. "Captain, I've got something. There's a data core still active deeper inside." "Lead the way," Voss replied. "But keep your eyes peeled." As they moved through the darkened corridors, the temperature seemed to drop. The air grew colder, despite the sweltering heat outside. Then, as they rounded a corner, Lyra's console flickered with another transmission. "Deathworlders has sneaky bastards." But this time, the voice was not crackling over the comms, it was coming from somewhere within the shadows ahead. Captain Voss raised her hand, signaling the team to stop. "Everyone, weapons ready." The lights flickered again, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. For a brief moment, Voss thought she saw a figure, a twisted, humanoid shape darting between the machinery. But when she turned to look, it was gone. Before she could issue an order, a guttural scream echoed through the halls, followed by the sound of tearing metal. The team turned just in time to see Zorak's massive form being dragged into the darkness by something that moved too fast to see. The message on Lyra's console flashed once more. "Can't trust what you see. Deathworlders has sneaky bastards." Voss gritted her teeth. They were no longer the hunters. They had become the hunted. "We need to move." Captain Voss barked, her voice sharp over the crackling comms. The echoes of Sergeant Zorak's scream still lingered in the cold air, but there was no time to mourn. The hulking Golaric warrior had been snatched in the blink of an eye, disappearing into the shadows without a trace. And now, the air in the outpost felt thicker, colder, like they were being suffocated by an invisible force. The remaining members of the team tightened their formation, the beams from their suit lights cutting through the darkness in jittery, nervous sweeps. Lyra's cybernetic eyes flickered as she scanned the hallways, trying to make sense of the erratic readings flooding her visor. "Captain, the interference is getting worse," Lyra reported, her voice laced with frustration. "I can't get a stable read on anything. It's like something's jamming us on multiple frequencies." Captain Voss nodded curtly, gripping her plasma pistol tighter. She could feel the tension among her crew. Fear was creeping in, and they all knew that panic would be the death of them. This outpost was no ordinary ruin. It was a labyrinth, one that twisted and turned as if alive, each corridor darker and more disorienting than the last. "Kale," Voss said, turning to her first officer, "I need you to keep an eye on our rear. Lyra, stay close to me and keep trying to decrypt whatever data you can from that core. We need to figure out what happened here." The group pressed forward, moving deeper into the outpost. The air was frigid, their breaths misting in front of their visors. Every so often, the flickering lights revealed glimpses of what might have once been a thriving station, now overrun with decay and strange, bioluminescent growths that pulsed faintly like dying embers. The team entered a cavernous chamber that had once been the outpost's command center. The ceiling was partially collapsed, allowing beams of sickly green light from the planet's surface to filter through. Broken consoles and shattered monitors were strewn across the floor, and the walls were covered in cryptic alien symbols. Lyra quickly set to work, jacking into one of the least damaged consoles. Her fingers moved with a practiced speed, and soon, holographic screens flickered to life. Data streams flowed, filling the air with erratic bursts of static. "Captain, I've accessed part of the outpost's logs," she said, her voice tense but steady. "It looks like this place belonged to a research team sent by the Commonwealth decades ago. They were studying the native fauna, something they called shadow hunters." Voss's brows furrowed. "Shadow hunters? Sounds like something straight out of a horror story." Lyra nodded grimly. "According to these logs, they're a species native to this death world. Masters of stealth and mimicry. The researchers believed the shadow hunters could bend light and sound to create illusions, or even impersonate their prey." A chill ran down Voss's spine. "So those warnings we intercepted, they weren't just garbled transmissions. They were trying to tell us exactly what we're up against." Kale, who had been keeping a vigilant watch at the rear, suddenly stiffened. His sensitive Rillian ears twitched. "Captain, I heard something. Movement in the ducts above us." Before anyone could react, a shadow dropped from the ceiling, landing silently behind Lyra. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its form shifting as if made of liquid darkness. But before it could strike, Voss's instincts kicked in. She whirled around, firing her plasma pistol. The beam illuminated the creature, revealing a mass of chitinous limbs and writhing tendrils. The blast tore through its midsection, and it let out a blood-curdling screech before dissolving into a pool of shimmering goo. But even as it disintegrated, its twisted face seemed to warp into an eerie, mocking smile. "Lyra, get that data and let's move," Voss shouted. The tech specialist frantically downloaded what she could from the outpost's failing systems. The heart of the darkness with the data core secured, Voss led her team deeper into the labyrinthine corridors, guided by the fragmented map Lyra had managed to extract. But the further they ventured, the more surreal the environment became. Hallways twisted upon themselves, rooms seemed to shift locations, and the flickering lights cast grotesque shadows that danced like phantoms. Kale muttered a low Rillian curse. "This place is playing tricks on us, Captain. I don't trust anything we see." Lyra, still trying to make sense of the scrambled data, spoke up. "The logs mentioned that the shadow hunters have some kind of psychic ability. They can distort perceptions, create illusions. That's why the outpost felt they couldn't trust their own senses." Voss grimaced. "Great. Just what we needed, enemies that can mess with our minds." As they pushed onward, they came across a massive, sealed door marked with ancient alien runes. It was partially ajar, and a cold, unnatural light spilled from the crack. The signal they had been following was stronger here, pulsing like a heartbeat. "This is it," Voss said, signaling for Kale to take point. The Rillian officer pried the door open with a groan of metal, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The room was dominated by a central pillar covered in what appeared to be living tendrils, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. Around the pillar, floating holograms displayed images of various species: humans, Rillians, Golaric Sol in various states of distress. The images flickered and warped, distorting into grotesque parodies of the original forms. Lyra's eyes widened as she scanned the pillar. "Captain, this isn't just a research station. It's some kind of experiment." "Experiment?" Voss asked, her voice tight. "What kind of experiment?" Before Lyra could answer, the pillar's holograms shifted, displaying a new image. This time, it was of the Reclaimer's crew. Voss's heart skipped a beat as she saw her own face staring back at her, distorted and twisted into a monstrous grin. "They've been watching us," Kale said, his voice barely a whisper. "Studying us." A sudden clang echoed behind them, followed by the sound of skittering claws. The team spun around, weapons at the ready, but all they saw were shadows dancing in the flickering light. "Captain, we're surrounded!" Kale shouted, raising his rifle as figures began to materialize from the darkness. They were humanoid, but their bodies shifted and flickered, as if they were caught between different forms. "They're not real," Voss yelled, trying to keep her team calm. "Don't trust your eyes." But the illusions grew more convincing with each passing moment. The shadow hunters were closing in, their forms blending seamlessly into the environment. Lyra's voice crackled through the comms, strained with panic. "Captain, we need to destroy that pillar. It's amplifying their psychic field." Without hesitation, Voss aimed her plasma pistol at the central pillar. "Everyone, cover me," she ordered, firing shot after shot into the writhing mass of tendrils. The pillar shuddered, its glow dimming, but the creatures around them grew more frantic, as if realizing their lifeline was being severed. Finally, with a deafening roar, the pillar exploded in a burst of light and energy, sending waves of psychic backlash rippling through the chamber. The shadow hunters shrieked, their forms flickering violently before collapsing into heaps of formless black sludge. Breathing heavily, Voss turned to her team. They were battered, exhausted, but alive. The holograms had vanished, and the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. But as Lyra continued to scan the area, her expression darkened. "Captain, I've decrypted one last piece of data. The shadow hunters, they've perfected their mimicry. Some of their victims didn't even realize they had been replaced." Voss's blood ran cold. "Are you saying?" Lyra nodded slowly. "They could have infiltrated our ranks. Even now, we might not be alone." Captain Voss took a deep breath, gripping her weapon tighter. The mission was far from over. The real nightmare was only just beginning. The faint flicker of emergency lighting cast an ominous, blood-red glow as Captain Voss led her team deeper into the bowels of the outpost. The air was thick with a noxious blend of metallic tang and rotting organic matter. Every breath tasted like acid on the back of their throats. The explosions from the previous battle had destabilized the structure, causing tremors that rattled the floor beneath their feet. "Stay sharp," Voss commanded, her voice a low growl over the comms. "We don't know how many of those things are left." Kale, the Rillian first officer, brought up the rear, his rifle swiveling to cover the shifting shadows behind them. Lyra, their tech specialist, was in the center of the formation, frantically typing away on her wrist console. The partially decrypted data she had managed to extract from the research logs still haunted her mind. Lyra's voice crackled through the comms. "Captain, I've unlocked more of the files." The researchers, they weren't just studying the shadow hunters. They were trying to harness their abilities. Voss clenched her jaw. "Harness them? For what?" Lyra paused, her eyes darting over lines of alien script. "It looks like they were experimenting with some kind of neural interface using the shadow hunter's psychic mimicry to create living weapons. They were trying to turn them into infiltrators that could replace high-value targets within the Commonwealth." Kale let out a hiss, his Rillian eyes narrowing. "So they wanted to unleash these things on unsuspecting worlds? Madness." Voss's grip tightened on her plasma pistol. "Then they paid the price for their arrogance. But we're not sticking around to share their fate. Let's find a way out of this death trap." The silent hallway, as they moved through the decaying corridors, the oppressive silence pressed down on them like a weight. The once active outpost now felt like a tomb. The occasional flicker of overhead lights only served to heighten their paranoia. Lyra's scanner began to emit a soft beep. She stopped abruptly, staring at her readings. "Captain, I'm picking up life signs ahead. Faint, but they're not human." Voss signaled for silence, raising her fist. "We proceed with caution. Kale, take point. Lyra, stay behind me." Kale nodded and crept forward, his rifle raised. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, lined with cylindrical tanks filled with a viscous green fluid. The murky liquid obscured the contents, but the vague shapes inside twisted and writhed as if they were alive. The team froze as a low, rasping voice echoed through their comms. Deathworlders, always so curious. But curiosity can be fatal. Voss's eyes widened. The voice wasn't coming from the chamber. It was echoing directly into their comm system. "Identify yourself," she demanded, her voice steady despite the chill creeping up her spine. The response was a harsh, mocking laugh. "We've watched you since you arrived. Studied your weaknesses. Your loyalty. Your fear." Suddenly, the tanks around them lit up, revealing their contents humanoid figures suspended in the green fluid, their eyes open but lifeless. Lyra's horrified gasp filled the comms as she recognized one of the figures. "Captain, that's Zorak." But it couldn't be true. Zorak had been taken right before their eyes, dragged into the shadows. How could he already be preserved in one of these tanks? Voss's mind raced. If that was Zorak, then who or what had they seen taken in the outpost earlier? "It's a mimicry lab," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "These aren't just cloning vats, the shadow hunters have been replacing the crew with perfect copies." A new enemy emerges. A sudden, high-pitched shriek echoed from behind them, followed by the rapid clattering of clawed feet. Voss spun around, her weapon at the ready. The corridor behind them was now teeming with grotesque figures, their forms shifting and flickering like poorly tuned holograms. They were the shadow hunters, emerging from the darkness like phantoms. Kale opened fire, his rifle spitting blue plasma bolts. "We're surrounded, Captain." Voss's mind raced. The shadow hunter's ability to mimic appearances meant that any of them could be an imposter. But now was not the time for paranoia, they needed to survive. "Lyra, find us an exit." Voss shouted over the din of battle. Lyra's fingers flew over her console. "I've located an emergency tunnel leading to the surface. It's not far, but we'll need to cut through that mob to reach it." The shadow hunters surged forward, their grotesque forms flickering between human-like shapes and monstrous insectoid forms. Voss fired her plasma pistol, each shot lighting up the darkness with a blinding flash. But for every creature they felled, two more seemed to take its place. As they fought their way through the horde, Lyra's suit detected another encrypted message being transmitted. It was on the same frequency as the distress signal that had brought them here. "Can't trust your team. Deathworlders has sneaky bastards." Lyra's eyes widened in horror as she realized what the message meant. The shadow hunters weren't just mimicking the dead, they were learning. They had likely already infiltrated the reclaimer itself, replacing members of the crew with their own twisted replicas. "Captain," Lyra called out breathlessly, "we can't go back to the ship. They might already be on board. We could be walking into a trap." But Voss was resolute. "We don't have a choice. If we stay here, we're dead. We'll deal with whatever's on the reclaimer when we get there." The escape. The team fought their way through the horde, each step a desperate push toward the emergency exit Lyra had found. The creatures came at them from all sides, their grotesque forms shifting and shimmering, making it nearly impossible to get a clear shot. Kale's rifle ran dry, and he switched to his combat blade, slicing through chitin and sinew. Voss covered Lyra as she worked to override the emergency door. The panel was ancient, covered in alien script that made no sense, but Lyra's cybernetic implants were working overtime to decipher it. Sweat dripped down her face as she furiously typed in codes, trying to force the door open. "Got it!" Lyra shouted as the door slid open with a rusty groan. The team rushed through, sealing the door behind them. But as they caught their breath in the dimly lit tunnel beyond, a chilling realization settled in the pit of Voss's stomach. The voice over the comms had gone silent, but its parting message still echoed in her mind: "Deathworlders has sneaky bastards. But maybe you brought them with you." Lyra scanned their surroundings. "Captain, I'm detecting movement ahead and behind." Voss gritted her teeth. They were being funneled, herded like prey. The shadow hunters knew every inch of this outpost, and now, it seemed they were toying with their quarry. "Keep moving," Voss ordered. "We stick together, no matter what." But as they sprinted through the winding tunnel, the lights flickered, plunging them into darkness. For a heart-stopping moment, they were completely blind. And then, when the lights came back on, Kale was gone. "Kale!" Voss shouted, but there was no response. Just the mocking laughter of the shadow hunters echoing through the tunnel. Lyra's eyes were wide with panic. "Captain, I think it's just the two of us now." Voss's heart pounded as she stared down the dark corridor, where the shadows seemed to dance and twist with a life of their own. The Reclaimer was just beyond this hellish labyrinth, but now she wasn't sure if she could even trust the person standing beside her. Captain Thera Voss's breaths were shallow and quick as she led Lyra through the narrow tunnel. The only sound was the muffled crunch of their boots against the metal floor and the distant, echoing whispers of the shadow hunters. The oppressive darkness seemed to stretch on forever, broken only by the flickering lights of their suit lamps. Voss couldn't shake the gnawing fear that Lyra might not be who she claimed to be, especially after Kale's sudden disappearance. "Keep moving," Voss urged, her voice a low growl over the comms. "We're almost there." "Captain," Lyra panted, clutching her side. "I'm getting interference again. The shadow hunters. They're trying to disrupt our systems. I can barely keep my scanners online." Voss glanced over her shoulder, her plasma pistol at the ready. The tunnel behind them was shrouded in darkness, but she could feel the cold, creeping sensation of being watched. "Let's just get to the emergency exit. We can't afford to be trapped down here." They reached a fork in the tunnel. The path to the left led back toward the surface, where their shuttle redemption awaited, but Lyra hesitated. "Captain," she said, her eyes wide, staring at her scanner, "I'm getting strange readings to the right. It's like there's another signal. But it's using our comm frequencies." Voss's jaw clenched. They couldn't afford any more delays, but ignoring this could mean walking into an ambush. "Let's check it out. But stay sharp." The decoy room following the signal, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit chamber that resembled a control room. The air was stifling, heavy with the scent of decay and burnt electronics. Monitors lined the walls, each flickering with static. At the center of the room was a device that looked like a twisted amalgamation of alien and Commonwealth technology, wires snaking out like the roots of some monstrous plant. "What the hell is this?" Voss muttered, stepping forward cautiously. Lyra's eyes darted over the controls, her cybernetic implants whirring as she tried to make sense of the data streaming across the screens. "It looks like some sort of signal relay. But it's broadcasting in bursts that mimic our own communications." Voss's heart sank. "They've been using it to intercept our transmissions. And maybe even to manipulate our comms. That's how they knew our every move." Suddenly, the screens went dark, and a single message flashed in blood-red letters: "Deathworlders has sneaky bastards. Your crew isn't who they seem." A cold realization gripped Voss. "Lyra, if the shadow hunters can mimic us perfectly, how can I trust you're still yourself?" Lyra's eyes widened in shock, her hands frozen over the console. "Captain, it's me." I dashed before she could finish. A shudder reverberated through the room, and the walls seemed to ripple like water. Voss's instincts screamed at her. She delved to the side just as the console Lyra had been working on exploded in a shower of sparks. When Voss turned, Lyra was gone. "Damn it!" Voss hissed. She was alone now, surrounded by the mocking laughter of the shadow hunters. But she didn't have time to mourn or second-guess herself. She had to make it to the surface and warn the Reclaimer if there was anything left to warn. The ambush. Captain Voss sprinted down the darkened tunnels, every step echoing ominously. The emergency tunnel Lyra had mapped out was up ahead, marked by the faint glow of a green exit sign. But as she reached it, the ground beneath her feet shifted, and the walls began to shimmer. The familiar corridor twisted, transforming into a nightmare labyrinth. Voss cursed under her breath. The shadow hunters were toying with her again, using their psychic abilities to distort her surroundings. She closed her eyes, focusing on the rhythmic sound of her breathing, trying to filter out the illusions. "Focus, Thera," she whispered to herself. "You've survived worse." When she opened her eyes again, the illusions flickered, revealing the true path ahead. But just as she started forward, a familiar voice echoed through the comms. "Captain, wait. It's me, Lyra. Don't leave me behind." Voss hesitated. The voice was panicked, pleading, but she couldn't trust her ears anymore. "Prove it," she growled. "Tell me something only the real Lyra would know." The voice hesitated, then spoke softly. "You once told me about your daughter, how you lost her to the Merrick's plague. That's why you joined the Commonwealth to find a cure." Voss's heart clenched. It was true, she had shared that secret with Lyra during a quiet moment on a long mission. But she knew the Shadow Hunters had access to their memories now. They could be using her own thoughts against her. Before she could respond, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Lyra, or at least, it looked like her. The tech specialist's face was streaked with dirt and fear, her eyes wide and desperate. "Captain, please." "I'm real," Lyra pleaded, her hands raised. "We need to get out of here together." Voss kept her pistol trained on Lyra, her finger hovering over the trigger. "If you're really Lyra, you'll know what I told you right before we landed on this hellhole." Lyra blinked, her expression twisting in confusion. You told me to watch your back. To trust no one. That was wrong." Voss had actually said, "Stick close and don't wander off." Without hesitation, Voss pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt struck the imposter in the chest, and with a howl, the creature's form shifted, dissolving into a writhing mass of tendrils before collapsing into a pool of black ooze. "Sneaky bastards," Voss muttered, her voice shaking. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not even for a moment. Escape to the reclaimer. Voss finally reached the exit. The blast doors were partially jammed, but with a grunt, she forced them open. The cold, acidic rain of the Deathworld lashed against her helmet as she emerged onto the surface. In the distance, the familiar shape of the shuttle Redemption waited, engines humming softly. She sprinted across the uneven terrain, her boots slipping on the slick, bioluminescent moss. The ramp to the shuttle lowered as she approached, but a nagging doubt gnawed at her mind. The Shadow Hunters could have already infiltrated the shuttle. What if this was another trap? "This is Captain Voss," she spoke into her comms, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. "Identify yourself, pilot." The reply came almost immediately. "Ensign Graves here, Captain. We've been trying to reach you." "Is it really you?" She hesitated. "Give me the override code for emergency extraction." A pause. Then, Alpha 7 Xenon 3. It was correct. Voss climbed aboard, her eyes scanning every corner of the shuttle. Graves was at the controls, looking haggard but alive. "Where's the rest of the crew?" Voss demanded. "Gone," Graves replied, his voice barely a whisper. "We lost contact after you went dark." "The ship, something's wrong up there, Captain." The final revelation. As the shuttle ascended toward the reclaimer, Voss's mind was a whirlwind of dread and suspicion. She could trust no one, not even herself. For all she knew, she could have been replaced during one of the illusions, a puppet of the Shadow Hunters without even realizing it. The reclaimer loomed into view, its hull scarred and battered. The docking bay opened, welcoming them back. But as they touched down, the emergency lights on the ship flickered ominously, casting the bay in a sickly red glow. Voss turned to Graves, her plasma pistol raised. "One last question, Ensign. What was the first thing I said to you when we left Commonwealth space?" Graves' eyes widened in confusion. Captain, I don't remember. It was weeks ago. Wrong answer. Voss fired, and the imposter crumpled to the floor, its body dissolving into a pool of black ooze. She stepped over the remains and headed deeper into the ship, her weapon at the ready. The comms crackled one last time with that cold, mocking voice. Deathworlders has sneaky bastards. But you'll never know, if you're one of them now. Captain Voss didn't respond. She had only one mission left, to secure the ship or destroy it. The Reclaimer would not fall into the hands of the Shadow Hunters. She would rather burn it all down than let these creatures win. The end, or perhaps, a new beginning.